European Union Chief Ursula von der Leyen meets with US President Joe Biden at the White House to discuss coordinating efforts on Ukraine and trade issues. Hello, I'm Arlen Neiderman. This is The Heat. After months of expressing concerns about the U.S. Inflation Act, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the European Union is now on board with the United States. European leaders had expressed concerns that tax incentives for green industries would divert investment away from Europe and hurt their economies. This is what von der Leyen had to say after the meeting with President Biden.
We agreed that we will work on critical raw materials that have been sourced or processed in the European Union and to give them the access to the American market as if they were sourced in the American market. We agreed on a transparency dialogue concerning the incentives that are given to the clean tech industry. For us, it's important on both sides of the Atlantic to know what kind of incentives are being given to the clean tech industry, to make sure that we join forces to boost the clean tech industry that is crucial and paramount for reaching a circular economy, a net zero economy.
Right, for more now on the US-EU talks, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Anton Fedyashin. He's a Russian affairs expert and professor of history at American University. From Alexandria, Virginia, James P. Moore is the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society. Victor Gao is a chair professor at Soochow University in Beijing. And Joav Toker is an assistant professor with the American Graduate School of International Affairs and Diplomacy. He joins us from Paris. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Joav Toker, Ursula von der Leyen clearly had a lot to discuss with President Biden while she was here in Washington. There are trade issues, there's Ukraine, they probably discussed China as well. But why do you think this visit took place? What did she hope to achieve?
Well, I think what we heard from her a minute ago is a good illustration, not necessarily of everything which took place and was coming forth during the conversation, but what the major ambition of both the Europeans and the Americans may have been, namely to relatively calm down the overall scene, which is extremely complicated, which is loaded with, sure enough, trade issues and the Russian-Ukrainian war issues and medium and long-range issues which are not necessarily on harmonious comprehension between the Americans and the Europeans. And you add to that, of course, that European agenda is cut down up to 27 different members of the EU. So things are more complicated than they appear. But the most important thing and the first, I believe, the first priority message, both towards Europe internally and regarding the American scene, is yes, we do understand each other. Yes, we work together in order to enlarge our domain of comprehension. So this is actually what she said in the public statement, and I believe that something had been contributed to that level of comprehension during the concrete discussions of concrete issues, and the list is long.
Yeah. Joav, as you say, there are 27 members of the European Union. I mean, does she have a mandate from all 27 to speak on their behalf?
No, it doesn't work this way in the specific form or necessity to have 1 and 2 and 3 up to 27 members. It is common in EU internal negotiations, and when the question of common posture is on the table, to believe that the major powers of the Union, namely the Germans and the French and the Italians and the Spaniards and the Poles, would get together and get some kind of overall comprehension which would be distilled one way or the other regarding the medium-sized and the small-sized member of the Union. And if there are difficulties now, every now and then regarding a very harsh, rigid resistance of one or two or three members, then there are internal practices within the union to overcome those.
Right.
There is no exception this time. I would even say that due to the very dramatic circumstances of the last year, diplomatically and militarily, there are even less differences, discrepancies in the internal cohesion of the 27 members than say the situation 2 or 5 or 8 years ago.
James Moore, let's talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. When that was unveiled in the United States, there was a lot of complaints from the Europeans. In fact, one American news organization described them as howls of disapproval from the Europeans on the Inflation Reduction Act. The EU contends that the measures unfairly benefit United States companies and violates World Trade Organization rules. But now we hear from Ursula von der Leyen that she welcomes the Inflation Reduction Act. What do you think is going on here?
Well, first of all, I think it's so important. I completely agree that things have never been more complicated, and yet there's such a straightforward relationship that exists between the European Union and the United States today that, quite frankly, I'm not sure has ever quite existed. And it's a result of several things. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really near and dear to the heart here in the United States, particularly given recent statistics on the job front and the concern that inflation is continuing to rise here in the United States in what is quite a robust growth economy, is something that we're having to deal with here in the United States. But what is so terrific about having Ursula von der Leyen come to the United States and to Washington is that there is such a comfort level between the European Union and the United States that sitting down with President Biden is a very natural thing. And I think at the end of the day, there have been glitches, something that the word was used when President Macron spoke with President Biden not long ago in dealing with all this. But I think a lot of this is going to be worked out in the coming weeks.
Right, you say a comfort level there, James, but what happened to those complaints about the fact that the Inflation Reduction Act would mean tax breaks for U.S. companies, would mean subsidizing green industries, would mean, as they put it, violating World Trade Organization rules?
Well, having been involved in the creation of the World Trade Organization, I am very sensitive to the issue of what is right and what is wrong as far as the World Trade Organization is concerned. There is no question that there is an industrial policy that is evolving in Washington that never existed quite before as a result of climate change, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and other issues regarding supply routes, et cetera. But I think that there are going to have to be these glitches that are going to have to be worked out. Yes, the bill has now turned into law, but there still is room on the part of the Biden administration to be able to tweak some of this, and recognizing that the European Union itself is going to be involved in coming up with some measures that will certainly counteract the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States.
Victor Gao, as we heard, the United States is working on a trade agreement with Europe on critical minerals. China, of course, is the largest producer of these critical minerals. It has considerable deposits of nickel, copper, cobalt, and lithium. These are all essential in the renewable energy industry. How will this agreement impact China, and how will China respond?
First of all, I think other things being equal, if the United States and Europe want to improve their relations in the real sense of the word, it's not a problem. It should be welcomed. However, there is an urgent need to recognize that between the two sides of the North Atlantic, there are really reasons to believe that there are deeply rooted rifts between the United States and European countries, because the United States has the instinct to put America first on top of other countries. And the war in Ukraine doesn't actually stop such instinctive impulses from the United States. Actually, there is an increase in such attempts to benefit at the expense of the European countries. And there are traditional areas of constant frictions, conflict between the European countries and the United States, for example, aviation, pharmaceuticals, intellectual rights protection, digital economy, you name it. Lots of areas where each side accuses the other side of being unfair, benefiting at the other side's expenses, for example. And I don't think the meeting between President Biden and von der Leyen will put an end to this. Actually, the war in Ukraine seems to widen such areas of conflicts between the European countries and the United States. Now, talking about the minerals agreement between the European countries and the United States, I just want to emphasize one point. If you are talking about new and renewable sources of energy, there is no denying that China is a dominant player in this regard. Wind and solar and all kinds of materials, machineries, etc. Therefore, between the two sides of the Atlantic, if they are really talking about real business, they need to really adopt a free trade mentality, not only between the two sides of the Atlantic, but also with major countries like China, because otherwise you are being hypocritical and double standards about free trade. You are really putting an ideological twist to the so-called free trade, and eventually you will not get free trade. You will get, a very much ideologically driven twist, which will distort free trade. And excluding China is not the right way getting out of this. Right. And between the two sides of the Atlantic, if they really do not engage in real trade, fair trade with each other, eventually they cannot stop all these conflicts and frictions between the United States and European Union.
All right, let me get a quick response to that from James Moore. James?
Honestly, I really disagree. I think that the relationship between the European Union and the United States is so close, particularly as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that a lot of these obstacles and challenges that you're talking about are ones that can ultimately be overcome. Sure, there are going to be a lot of problems that exist into the future, and there's going to be concerns of what exactly constitutes free trade or not. But as far as the relationship between the European Union and the United States and working these things out, I think is very much on an up note.
All right, Anton Fedyashin, what's your view on this? Is there this rock-solid unity between the United States and Europe, especially when it concerns Ukraine? I mean, Victor was talking a moment ago about differences between Europe and the United States, about rifts developing in this relationship.
I think there are disagreements about certain things, but I think that ultimately, given the nature of the economic relationship between the EU and the United States, it will be the American decision that will predominate. I think James has a good point in emphasizing the fact that whatever crinks, whatever disagreements there may be, will be resolved. But the real question here is on whose terms and in whose favor. And I've no doubt that they will be resolved in the favor of the United States, because as Victor pointed out a little bit earlier, one of the things that the Ukraine war has done is sped up the emergence of a Western trading, geo-economic and also geopolitical bloc. With the destruction of the 3 threads of the Nord Stream pipeline, Europe is now more dependent on the United States in terms of gas, which is more expensive, by the way, than they ever got from the Soviets and then the Russians. And Europe is becoming increasingly dependent on the US economically. And I'm sure that one of the issues that was also discussed today is the EU's relationship with China. And the US has never hidden the fact that it wants to sort of pull the EU towards itself and compete with China, oppose China economically. And so Europe is being pulled into the American orbit. Its energy sources are now more expensive. Its industrial products will be more expensive as a result. And that's why Thierry Breton, who is the EU's sort of chief economic negotiator, has spoken repeatedly and publicly, he's on record, about the threat of deindustrialization. This makes the EU more dependent on the US. and less influential as an international economic player, as a bloc, I mean, which, after all, is why the EU was created in the first place.
Joav, Toker, what do you think? I mean, is this a relationship of equals? Do they see each other as equals, or is this the United States making it clear to the Europeans that we call the shots, you follow?
Well, I'm sure the Americans are more than polite in using perhaps expressions and adjectives which are smoother than the one you proposed. But I also think in a deeper sense that it is clear to everybody in this relationship between one big, powerful, dominant at times America and 27 members of the EU, the big ones and the small ones, that it is not a relation of equals, but in the sense that the cooperation between the two shores of the Atlantic may be profitable for actually both sides of the Atlantic. And this is why the criterion, or the trying to ask questions in terms of do they feel equals, or are the Europeans to a large extent sort of dominated by American military power and economic power and political influence, would perhaps not be the right way of putting the question. What I think one should add to this kind of analysis, and which refers to what was mentioned earlier in the show, both in Beijing and in Washington, is indeed, and I will surf on this, in terms of what is the share of so-called ideology, and what is the share of so-called proper interests, trade interests, economic interests, growth interests, wealth interests. Now, I would say that the last year, because of the war in Ukraine, had transformed the entire international sphere, but mainly when it comes to Europeans, into a more so-called ideological fragmentation. Don't forget, this war in Ukraine is happening over this land in Europe. Perhaps when you look at it from Washington or from Beijing or from Brasilia, it seems like a conflict which was very regrettable. For EU members, some of the EU members have common border, share a border with Russia. Some of the EU members, many of them, as a matter of fact, were part of the Soviet Union about 30 years ago. So the war in Ukraine, the nature of the war, namely one powerful, big country invades, crosses the border and invades the borders of another country, this is not something that you can fit into abstract models of ideology and interests and common sense in the long run and in the middle run and the short run. So yes, ideology plays more these days than 3 or 10 years ago in the way both Europeans and Americans are looking at issues, including the issues which at the bottom line, there would be figures and trade amounts and indeed some conflicts in the way you interpret what could be done or could not be done together or separately.
Okay. Victor Gao, talking about the Ukraine war, of course, China has presented its 12-point plan to resolve that conflict. Now, as far as Europe is concerned, some leaders in Europe have accepted the plan, others have criticized it. The United States has rejected the plan and called it a distraction. But the French president, Emmanuel Macron, he will travel to Beijing in April. Macron was one of those European leaders who was very receptive to the China plan. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
Listen, I think that everything towards peace is good, but this peace is only possible if first it starts with an end of Russia's aggression, a withdrawal of troops, and a respect of territorial sovereignty and of the Ukrainian people. And so within this context, I think it's also up to Ukraine to give the conditions. But the fact that China commits to peace efforts is good.
So, Victor, do you think Macron will be able to bridge that gap between his more skeptical EU partners on the one hand and, of course, with the United States on the other?
First of all, I think China's door will be wide open to welcome President Macron on his important state visit to China, hopefully in April. Secondly, for those who doubt China's sincerity and commitment to promote peace about the Ukrainian war, Look at what happened miraculously yesterday through China's mediation and good officers. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran reached an agreement here in Beijing for normalizing their relations. All of us know that the relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran are very tense for many years for very complicated reasons, and peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia is not easy. It's not very probable in a sense. And I think so long as all the major countries in the world are really dedicated to promoting peace, no matter how difficult it is still within our reach. China's position on the Ukrainian war is very, very clear. It's well made. For the record, China is by the side of peace. China calls on both Russia and Ukraine to stop the war, to cease fire, and then to restore peace. And whatever problems that they cannot resolve right away, they can shelve it for the moment, each declaring its own claims and positions for the record of mankind to have a good look at it. And eventually, time probably will be the best medicine. Why should anyone lose its entirety and lose lives of millions of people in order to solve some territorial claims which cannot be resolved right now, tonight, for example? So I think history will really mark it in a very excellent way, that the fact that China stands on the side of peace and is promoting peace with all its sincerity and commitment and resources. And I just hope China will pull off this again for the Ukrainian war, as it did just yesterday for normalization and rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. If you doubt about peace, then you will really go more deeply into war, I think. Never give up peace. Always give hope to peace. Let's work together to promote peace in Ukraine and anywhere else in the world.
James Moore, there was one difference between Europe and the United States, and that's on the issue of energy. European publics, we've seen, have become very restive on that particular issue. Energy prices have risen dramatically in Europe, and that's, of course, pushed the prices of other commodities up as well. Is that something, do you think, Ursula von der Leyen discussed with President Biden, the fact that European countries may not be able to sustain these high energy costs for a long time?
I'm sure that was part of the discussion, but I would also bet that at the beginning of that discussion on energy, there was some gratitude that was expressed by her to President Biden, because the president worked very hard with his administration to be able to find ways to be able to divert certain energy supplies elsewhere, to be able to take care of the surfeit that existed in Europe. And so, and indeed, energy is a great, great concern, but we've just gone through a winter that everybody was predicting could be a disastrous situation, particularly for Ukraine and over energy, but it fortunately did not materialize.
Anton, as James points out, we've gone through a winter. It was a relatively mild winter in Europe, but what does that mean? It means that they've survived, that the war could go on, that they will prevail?
It means that the Europeans survived this winter with fewer losses rather than more economically, but these losses will continue to mount. So first of all, the next cold winter, should it be next year or the year after, is going to change the situation. It will be tougher. Number two, part of the reason why the Europeans survived this winter is because they filled up their gas storage places with tanks with cheap Russian gas in the run-up to the winter. That cheap Russian gas is no longer there. So the Europeans can certainly continue to buy gas from the United States, from other suppliers. They are, by the way, buying Russian LNG gas, but at a huge price increase. But this is not a long-term solution for Europe, because prices on energy create systemic imbalances. when you have to pay more for gas or for oil or for kerosene or for diesel, the prices on everything that you consume and everything that you produce goes up. This means that the European states, social states, almost every single one of them without exception, will have to spend more money on subsidizing their populations. And at the same time, their goods will be less competitive on the international market. No one's terribly worried about that right now because the winter went by with minimal losses. But look, this is a very serious long-term problem. And the way things stand right now, Anand, there is no alternative to reliable, cheap supplies of Russian pipeline gas.
Joav, Toker, of course, if there was one incident that brings all of these things together, you know, the war, energy, as well as politics, and that was the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. Do you think Ursula von der Leyen asked any questions of President Biden on what happened there?
I wouldn't speculate on that. I may have some reasons to believe that on both chairs facing when the EU leader and American president were sitting on tête-à-tête, one in front of the other, both of them had for sure more information about the exact circumstances under which the pipelines were blown up. So maybe there was no need to ask for extra information. There is also a very plausible possibility that on both sides, on both chairs, on both fauteuils in the Oval Office, they're still waiting for some extra information, which may perhaps someday, when the archives open up, will give us in the public a better appreciation of what really happened there in the depth of the Baltic Sea. But I don't think it was part of the conversation between the two this afternoon.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and thank you for watching.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN.